We saw other figures at the edges of the clearing, Beige sitting on the rocks or by the crosshatch pond. The park was only slightly in Begel. A few meters at the edge of vegetation, a rill of crossover and paths and bushes, and a little stretch of totality cutting the two Ulkomen sections off from each other. Maps made clear to walkers where they might go. It was here in the crosshatch that the students might stand, scandalously, touching distance from a foreign power, a pornography of separation.
A weird language in this book, right?
It's wild.
You might call it new weird. We'll get into it.
Welcome back to the Socialist Shelf.
You're now listening to
I, as
Socialist
always,
Shelf
am Lenore,
Radio.
here with Jacob, and you guessed it, we got another three-person job today. This is a wild book, and so to help us sort of parse this, we have a very special guest, Breht O'Shea from RevLeft. How you doing, Breht?
I'm doing great, yeah. Thank you so much for having me on. This is an exciting and interesting and unique read, and I think it has lots of really interesting Marxist and Althusserian concepts that I'm looking forward to exploring today.
Definitely.
For sure.
And before we just get into it, I liked it. I've been trying to do plugs more at the top because not everyone always listens through a whole episode. So Breht, can you tell folks about RevLeft Radio real quick? A lot of folks may have heard of it, but if in case they haven't, it's a show worth checking out. So I want to go ahead and do that now, so nobody has an excuse that they didn't hear the plug.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, RevLeft Radio is something we've been doing for about 8 years now. It started in 2017 with the first Trump administration, just trying to broaden the political horizon of people in a moment of reaction. It came out of local organizing on the ground and the need for political education here in Omaha, and we honestly thought it was just going to be a localized political education kind of tool, and it, to all of our surprise, took off immediately. And now we have a global audience, and I'm very, appreciative and humbled by the growth of the show. But yeah, we cover history, we cover theory, we cover current events. I have a co-host, Allison, who we also do our sister podcast, Menace, where we dive deep into Marxist texts, explicate them, reflect on them, and apply them to our conditions today. And so overall, I just hope people find it not only informative, but also inspiring. And all of it is geared towards getting people active, getting people educated so that they can go out and organize and put their theory into practice. So I hope we succeed at that.
Hell yeah, absolutely.
So far, so good.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. So today we are talking about The City and the City. It is a book by China Miéville, who, once again, we're doing a living author, folks. At one point we said we would never do a living author. It seemed like it. Now we've done a good handful of them. Not all good people. We've done James Comey. We've done J.D. Vance. But this guy, much better than those two individuals, let's say, for sure. He's a founder of the New Weird, which, if you want to know what that is, don't try too hard to define it. It's very difficult, but basically it's a sort of genre that elevates the pulp form, largely evolved from weird tales. If you read Inner Zone or you read Black Static or Tenebris Press, a lot of that is sort of New Weird. Honestly, it really, for me, I identify it with that period from like 95 to 2007, 2008 of that sort of not early internet, but that internet where things are developing, people get that capacity. I think once you get past a certain point of social media, you maybe aren't in this exact same period. But he is kind of considered like the main guy. In fact, New Weird is a term coined in the introduction of one of his books. But he is a British man, lived most of his life in London, born in 1972. I thought this was interesting. His mother's a translator. So he grew up in a household. His mom's a professional translator. And you see a lot in this book, like his focus on English, like even though the book is written in English, the characters are, speaking another language. And sometimes it'll say they said the term in English, or, they used this terminology. And, I think there maybe is some DNA of that, like upbringing of his mom being a translator and him, of course, being fascinated with words.
Almost certainly. And you see also as well, like the I forget the specific word for it, a word that's like specifically like made up but illustrates the point you're trying to get across. Stuff like dopplerbinology.
Yeah.
Somebody exposed to the areas where these things sort of crosshatch and intervene, these languages, I imagine would have a lot of fun playing in that space.
So he actually went and taught English in Egypt for a while in his early 20s. Got him interested in politics of other countries. Also got him sort of questioning some of the stuff he'd been taught growing up, and just very traditional liberal British upbringing. And he ends up getting a bachelor's in anthropology from Cambridge and then a PhD in international law from London School of Economics. While he's doing that, he's also writing fiction and publishes King Rat in 1998, a book I don't know much about, but I know people liked it, but it didn't sell crazy. It wasn't until his next series that he started making real money on it. But he starts then writing the Bozlog series, which is early Victorian, sort of dark fantasy. And yeah, Perdetto Street Station, the first one in that, really is considered the first like mainstream new weird book. And this is also around the same time he briefly spent some time at Harvard on a fellowship there. And at Harvard, which I find this fascinating because it's like, how many times has this happened? He like gets into Marxism in 2001. I feel like, Harvard, we don't think of it as like whatever, but there's a lot of conversation happening. There's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of smart people, even if it's a very, institution, for lack of a better term. He said, dissatisfied with modern views of history. He gets frustrated with postmodernism, and he becomes interested in Marxism. Around 2005, he then publishes Equal Rights, a Marxist theory of international law, which is his thesis, basically turned into a book. And around the same time, he gets involved with the ISO in the United States and the Socialist Workers' Party in the United Kingdom. So he's kind of he would be like a self-identified Trotskyist, kind of fall into that field of things. But yeah, from then on, he kind of considered himself a Marxist Trotskyist in that zone. And he's actually written like some stuff on theoretical and historical side. Like he wrote that book October. Have either of y'all read that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like a fictionalized but historically accurate kind of portrayal of the Russian Bolshevik Revolution. And then he also wrote that book on the Communist Manifesto, analyzing it as a piece of literature. And I actually had him on the show on RevLeft to talk about that book. So if people are interested in the fiction and you're listening to a podcast like this, I think you'll certainly be interested in his forays into, the actual fictionalized but very, historically tethered book on the October Revolution. But also, I think his analysis of the Communist Manifesto was really interesting and deep and worth engaging with as for anyone who calls themselves, or thinks of themselves as a Marxist.
Yeah. He in everything you read by him, he's got a very dynamic style, very interesting, kind of weird in the sense of like kind of spectral. He's interested in that side of things, which he talks a lot about in that book on the Communist Manifesto, which I have read. I haven't read October. In 2013, he was involved in helping set up Left Unity in the UK. We don't have time to go that like whole direction, but there's a lot of interesting avenues there with UK politics and left politics there. But he has remained involved in trying to build a project there. And he also founded and edits Salvage Magazine out there. He's also, I remember in 2018 reading about this, he's been very interested in like online privacy, become very concerned about the way the internet impacts us. I think, and is concerned about the idea of like overreach and over understanding each other's lives and over control. And I think from this book, you can kind of see some of the DNA of that in there. And I found this kind of interesting. In 2024, he wrote a novel with Keanu Reeves. I haven't read it, but it's an interesting crossover. I like looked him up and the first thing came up with Keanu Reeves. And I was like, okay. So who knows? It's called Book of Elsewhere.
That was my Christmas present to my mother because I know she
Yeah.
loves. Yeah, I know she loves Keanu Reeves, and so that's kind of where I envision us like intersecting in terms of literary taste.
Okay. Have you read it, or you just knew she'd like it?
No, I'm gonna borrow it from her.
Okay, sure. Well, regardless, he holds the record for most Arthur C. Clarke awards. Very interested in just things like his traditional. I think a lot of more traditional fantasy inspirations, like tabletop RPGs and stuff. You have even got a chance to write for Pathfinder.
Oh
Um,
wow.
but and he cites a lot of the classic fantasy inspirations like Lovecraft and Ursula K. Le Guin. He did talk about the Strugatsky brothers, which is great. Go back to our episode on them, but he and he has a whole interesting. I would recommend people go read it. I'll link it, but he has an interesting article on Tolkien where he's like wrestling with being a British fantasy author, and he's like, you're either writing a Tolkien clone or you're intentionally not writing Tolkien and you're still living in the shadow of Tolkien. And I think that's kind of interesting. And considering we did that series not that long ago, another kind of interesting thing. But I wanted to read a quote from him real quick before we got into his book itself on being an artist and a revolutionary in this current period. And I thought that was neat. He says, aesthetic categories, including the weird and the spectral, have always been deeply polysemic. You can make ghosts do lots of contradictory things, even sometimes at the same time. Deflecting activism through or into the cultural stuff we like seems to me like an expression of political weakness. If we were stronger as a movement, we wouldn't give a shit about the politics of some Amazon Prime series. You know what I mean? So I think use whatever metaphors you want to live by that get you out of bed in the morning, but don't forget that there was nothing about this that is intrinsically liberatory. No one is saying that there is a rigid boundary or that you can't apply political analysis to cultural and artistic works. But I think that people who are taking opposition to the equivalence being made between art and activism have a much more serious, nuanced, and realistic relationship to the politics of art. To me, it's about having the humility to recognize that as an artist, it is no more and more, or you are no more or less historically special than a plumber or an Uber driver. That artistic practice is not more intrinsically intransigent or reverberative to the dynamics of power and oppression all around us. The idea that artistic creations, no matter how wonderful they might be, are to some degree immune from the ravages of neoliberalism as expressions of one's pure radical soul is just completely unconvincing to me. So I thought that was interesting. I especially like the idea of it's not that it's not useless, but like let's not elevate the artist over the plumber, over the Uber driver. And it's that kind of solidaristic working class culture that's actually useful and that actually makes for like a proletarian artist, which is what we love to hear.
Yeah, and flies in the face of the idea that any cultural producer can extract themselves from the system in which they operate, which is a pretense that many people of many different types, intellectuals, artists, etc., often convince themselves of. Just the very idea of being non-ideological that we hear so much in our society is a reflection of that absurd pretense that people have about how they think and how they operate in society.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm not ideological. I just designed the nice subway system so the old Coleman government can look good, right? It has nothing to do with politics.
Exactly.
Just as long as you're not in breach.
So, Brett, what made you interested in this? Because I know you put forward a couple ideas. What was it about this book that was it just good chance to read it or what?
Yeah, China's been somebody I've always kind of been interested in and known him primarily through October and the work on the Communist Manifesto. Interviewed him, liked him as a person and as an interlocutor in a discussion. And, I tend to read nonfiction much, much more just for my work and for my particular interests. But I've had many times in my life where I've had, deep phases of like diving into fiction and really loving literary fiction. I had a certain job, for example, in my early 20s where it was a lot of downtime at a desk. And so I used that to just plow through almost exclusively, works of fiction. So I've always wanted to kind of move to that side of his work, and I thought that this was a really cool opportunity because not only is it fiction and interesting, like it's a really interesting book in and of itself, and like I do recommend it to people, but also because it does have, and I was aware that it had, these concepts that I think are fruitful for socialists and Marxists to discuss, and I think that are relevant in lots of interesting ways to our own time and to issues like class and to issues like Palestine, and much more, even though it's a book I think written in 2009. So not even written in this moment, but because it deals with ideology, it's forever applicable to this moment.
Absolutely. Lenore, what about you? Do you have any history with his fiction?
Chalk this up as yet another socialist shell first for Lenore, certainly. And what a first it is, though. Like I drifted around China Miéville for a while. I have Unlundun like on my shelf, like I've had it forever, and it's just been on my list for a hot minute. So first one. And as far as like the new weird, as far as like cosmic horror goes, we're of course a century removed from Lovecraft, his heyday. You can definitely still see that DNA here, and that's what really intrigues me. Cosmic horror in ideology, in rhetorical like hegemony, in bureaucracy.
Yeah, I think that you bring us into the central premise there, right? Because you actually, as you start reading this book, it feels like, okay, there's something cosmic and like magic going on, you know? Uh, and I guess there is, and depending on how you want to define that, right? But what this book basically is about the city and the city. And they're these two cities that coexist at the exact same time, basically in the same place, cross mapped across each other. And due to, we don't know where it started or how it started or why, people on both sides are taught, and it is enforced, that you only pay attention to the city that you are in. You have to unsee the other side of the city, and you can go over there. It's not that we don't acknowledge it exists, but we've got a special tunnel we go through to join that, to go to that, and we treat it like it's another country. And in fact, it is actually extremely illegal to acknowledge physically that there is a building across from you. And at first, when I'm reading this, I'm like, okay, so there's like some magic, and you kind of see it. My reading on this is no, it's just there, and you're just not allowed to acknowledge it, which is of course funny. But then you get into enforcement and shit, and it's like, oh, this is actually quite terrifying.
It's the ultimate sitcom, like duct tape down the middle of the room, except it's like down the middle, down like several corners, like there are enclaves within enclaves.
I was gonna ask, so like Brett, like as you got into this, like I don't know, that it's such an interesting concept. At what point does your like mind here and here start like turning and start being like, wait, is this like what's up here? Like, I don't know. I'm curious.
Yeah. So of course, before you go in, you have some idea of what the book's about, and it's like the city and the city. Like, what does this mean? And so you look up some stuff. And as I'm researching a book to do with you all, obviously some things come up. It's like a city on top of a city. They exist in the same geographical space. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. So then I just go into the book without knowing too much else. And then it starts off as just kind of like a gritty detective noir, right? Like kind of the cynical tone of a gristled detective, finding another body and then having to go through the bureaucratic and professional navigations of trying to figure out who done it. But quickly, the little sentences start being thrown out there, like the word unsee.
Yeah.
And you're like, what does that mean? And he's walking, I think, after investigating the crime scene, and he says he looks down the block and he sees an old lady walking down the street, and he can tell by her clothes that he's not supposed to see her. Mm-hmm. And so if it kind of bleeds in at first. It's not obvious what's going on here. And I am very kind of impressed with how he built that up. At first as like an appealing intrigue mystery. Like, what does that sentence mean? I reread that sentence. I don't quite get it, especially if you come into the book with no knowledge of what this is about. It can be kind of confusing at first, but he really like slowly leads you into this world of interest. And there's a quote I found that I wanted to say up front,
yes, please.
And it kind of speaks to what you were saying. I actually lost the source because I just wrote this down in my notes, but Miéville, talking about the book, said, I wanted to write a noir that plays fair with the genre. No magic, no monsters, no fantasy, just a murder mystery in a weird setting that's not technically weird. And so I think that gives the game away with regards to, is this a magical place? No, it's not. Yeah. And I think we can get into like the material politics of it later, and the idea of Orsini, which I really want to explore as a material realm. But you have to take him at his word here that this is perceptual. This is ideological. This difference isn't magical. And as you said too, you can travel back and forth, right? They don't negate the existence of the other, but that trafficking is policed like a border, militarized like a border. And one of the interesting early scenes in the early chapters, and I'll stop after this, is when he's sitting in his like 6-story apartment. and right outside of his apartment goes a train. But he talks about it as a foreign train, and the foreign. So how could a train track right outside of your house be foreign?
Right.
You know, but that's how he starts. He walks you into this world, and so he can look out of his window when he's having coffee or whatever, see the train go by, catch the eyes of the foreign quote unquote passengers, and then everybody kind of looks away quickly out of like awkwardness. We're not supposed to see each other. We're not supposed to make eye contact. And so, yeah, I think he does a really fascinating job of like slow walking you into this weird world that you, as he goes on, you slowly start to put the pieces together. And then a lot is still left up to your imagination. Like, what is this place? Like, you know, I saw that quote, but if you didn't see that quote, I think people could very much assume that there's something magical or fantastical going on here, something even supernatural. But it's not that, and I think it's all the more interesting because of that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And you know, when I started reading this, I at first thought, okay, does this character have some special insight that other people don't have? But it's actually interesting. It's almost as if a city, because of how they've set it up, it's a city where everyone sees the stuff they're not supposed to see. Everyone is experiencing, you know, special powers. They're all, you know, can feel weird, like they're, you know, a very emperor has no clothes situation where it's like, okay, well, everybody else is going along with this. And I think but it does it in a much more, you know, sophisticated way, a way that you can kind of, if you really thought about it, you know, it gets into the systems. It's like, oh, we have embassies that if someone's visiting, they get trained. You know, we have a special police force that we don't like to invoke. We have unificationists who have their rules around what they should do. So the world feels very well realized. China actually took I'd say like a premise that could feel very silly, like could feel very like, you know, in other hands, it could be funny. Right. And made it like, okay, let's take this to its logical conclusion in like a mid-size, you know, or low-sized Eastern European economy, and apply it rigorously and like see what we come up with. And it's not a fun place to be in. And I won't harp on it too much, but I think that there is something, I think I feel very strongly that, and I'll talk about it more when we eventually do this. I feel very strongly that this probably influenced Robert Kurvitz's Sacred and Terrible Air and the game that would become Disco Elysium. I think there's a lot of shared DNA here. But I want to like flesh that out a little further. I may write something for the blog on that actually, but it's in my head. There's a lot of like that, not actual magic, but it feels like Lovecraftian horror. And I don't know, there's a lot happening.
It does border on magical realism, doesn't it, Jacob? These
borders on it because people can produce magic, and if in a way, you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, no,
We all
like,
do it.
this almost supernatural, right, ability to unsee things, to unperceive things, to participate in this mass delusion, I might say, that there's not this other city, you know, because it's sort of an open secret, you know, and you know, secret isn't even the right word, but like it's this sort of mass thing that everybody participates in. Whence part of the horror, right? Because there's an extra scrutiny on, you know, you talked about unificationists, right? There's an extra scrutiny on dissenters, unificationists, political actors on, you know, this or that fringe for noticing that the other city exists and acting on it, right? Even passively acting on it. Because, like, if our main character, Theodore Borlu, right? If our main character, who's a detective in the Begel police force, right? If he watched a sunset from Begel in Ulcoma, the other city, right, he'd be fine. But if you're a UNIF, perhaps, and you just react to an engine backfiring in the other city, right, that's grounds for being disappeared.
It's different levels of, you know, enforcement on people. I think it's also interesting, you know, the places he chooses to use it. There's a long and storied history of making fake Eastern European countries for weird fiction. That's just a fun thing to do. But this setting, it is interesting, you know, it is like Bezel is this city that he's from that is very like, you know, behind. They're developing slowly. We're not quite sure why, but it's just not great. They've got a few foreign partners. Ulcoma is doing a lot well. They sort of have this national party that it talks about, that they said they have this guy, this General Yisa, who is like, they said considered of a term with like Ataturk and Tito, and they make it a joke that Mao used to be in pictures next to him, and now they've taken it down for whatever reason. But he's like, but they've got this figure that is seen as sort of this maybe they don't get too much into it, but I find it interesting, semi third worldist or semi like this guy that's like, we're going our own way, we're building our own economy, and for that reason, like the United States still has Olcoma sanctioned even like all this time later, which is kind of funny. The United States sanctioning one of the two cities is pretty good. We would do that.
God, man. Just imagine figuring out the tariffs on that.
I do think there's and I think the two cities, they can be stand-ins for lots of different things, but on the surface they are this stand-in, and I mean I think China even talks about it could be apartheid, it could be gentrification, it could be class, and we can get into that, but on the surface it is like this more decaying, drab Eastern Bloc city of Basel, and then El Kuma, the modern westernizing, and thus economically upward city at the same time. So that is a sort of partition occurring in the post-collapse of the Soviet Union,
right,
of these different Eastern European cities deciding which way to go. And I mean, look at the Ukrainian conflict right now. It's about a lot of things, including NATO expansion, etc. But there is a real divide within the country itself, especially along geographical boundaries of do we turn east or do we turn west. And so, seeing these two cities on top of each other at the same place and time, but choosing, or, I guess in the case of Basel, there doesn't seem to be much choosing, but at least in El Kuma's case, choosing to westernize, that is a contradiction, a dualism, a partition that, racks Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and to some extent still exists now, and certainly existed during the writing of this text.
Definitely.
So I think that's it. But I also wanted to really quickly to a quote early on in the book, 'cause we were talking about how China kind of walks us in to this mystery. And, you could be forgiven for thinking this is magical. And here's a little statement that I thought at first kind of seemed magical. He says, and it also kind of attests to his writing skills and trying to, through words alone, give us this perceptual shift. But it's like on page 18, he says, "She took us through a darkened place where the balance of crosshatch shifted, and we were silent until the street lamps around us became again taller and familiarly deco-angled. Under those lights, the street we were on visible in a perspective curve away from us, women stood on the walls selling sex." So it's kind of this like Inception-like distortion where, like one city is bleeding into the other. The street lamps themselves are shaped differently and perhaps cast a different shade of light, and those are morphing in real time. So, you could be forgiven for thinking, and even in that moment, I sort of went back on that. I'm like, is something magical realism, is that occurring here? But I think it is interesting to see it as perceptual and ideological, the way that ideology, people in both of these cities are brought up under an ideological conditioning mechanism that makes them unsee these things and literally impacts their perception of material reality. And so that morphing and changing is them not seeing magical things shifting and morphing, but perceptually applying their conditioning to the real world as they navigate through it, which is utterly fascinating.
I had a professor in college, one of the, for all the talk about all these Marxist professors, I didn't find a lot of them, but I did find there was this one guy who was great. And he once said in a class, someone mentioned magical realism and what's the difference in magical realism, this and that. And he said, for my money, basically, he said, magical realism is basically realism when you're really paying attention, because there's some weird stuff that happens in our day to day. And he's also the guy who introduced me to Gramsci and everything like that. But he was very interested in these ideas of like, there are things that like some people might define as magic that we do all the time. Things like the concept of money, things like the concept of states, of borders, of things like that, which we all know are sort of useful fictions that people come up with. But they solidify when we stop seeing them as useful tools, as tools of just, existence or whatever, something to get to the next day. When, for example, money becomes capital, becomes a thing into itself, becomes an end to itself. For example, in this case, we don't know how these cities started, and I'm kind of glad we don't, because I think that would be too far like sidetrack. But at some point, it was considered useful to have these two societies that were growing alongside each other in parallel. Maybe it was religious, ethnic, we don't know. And now it's not about whatever that use case was or whatever that tribal reason or religious reason was. It was about, well, that's how it is. And then it's like, well, why is that right? And it's like, well, that's what the law is. It's like, well, why is that the law? And it's like, well, because that's the other city, and there are, what I find interesting is there's the two radical groups are, one, the unificationists, who seem to have the most logical opinion of like, what are we doing here? Right. But they're kind of seen as radical. But then on the far right radicals, you have people who are like, we should conquer the other city. And actually this system in place is holding us down. It's actually the only reason that there isn't just an Olcombe or just a Basel is because of these like laws. So it is also interesting to see like what a reactionary force looks like in this world. And it also can feel like absurd. Like we can kind of get a sensible chuckle out of it. But, I think, China's kind of inviting us to think like how much different is stuff that we actually just do in our own countries and our own lives day to day, And I don't mean that in some kind of like woo-woo, like money's fake thing. Obviously it's got material grounding in reality, but like it is a thing that we enforce. It's to be a Marxist is to understand that,
Yeah, well, and indeed, like this separation and this supernatural altering of one's perception. These people are brought up to consciously sort of do this until it becomes unconscious, and you can see it even in your own day-to-day life. I mean, you walk down the street, you might look past this or that decay, you might look past like this or that houseless person, and eventually like these things just sort of fade into the background for you, but they're no less real for it. And yeah, Miéville takes that a step farther and is like, okay, so what if this actually altered your perception of reality, right? And also, like, to scale back up to the division between the cities itself, right? The attempt to analyze it, right, itself resists analysis, right? The whole field of archaeology uncovers artifacts that are from very, very far in the past, that are from very, very recent, but it's irrespective of its level in like the substrate, right? You might find newer stuff much deeper, you might find older stuff much higher, right? All that matters essentially is pulling stuff out of the past and reappropriating it.
Yeah, I would like to play off that a little bit, which is, I think a central question of this text and what China is asking of us is, what are the things that we unsee in our daily lives? And I think, Lenore, you made a great point about some of the class dynamics, houseless people, the poverty that the wealth of the rich depend on, the way that there are these class stratifications of like a servant class and an upper wealthier consumer class, and how that's obscured in interactions where it's like, okay, we're just buying and selling. It's the open marketplace of ideas, and the class dimensions are kind of concealed and wrinkled away in that way, and the absurdity of class. Because when you really analyze class stratification, is fucking absurd. The people that are rich are not smarter. They're not harder working. They don't have better character. It's just honestly luck of the draw. Mm-hmm. What family were you born into? What area code were you born into? What connections do you have? And what inborn talents do you have? And what traumas in your life derailed you so that you couldn't actualize those talents, right? It's all utterly arbitrary. That itself, the arbitrary nature of class stratification, is something we unsee on a daily basis. So I think that's a really productive and political question that's at the beating heart of this text. And another example of that is like commodity fetishism, mm-hmm. right? The production of commodities is this, you were talking about this, the magical in the real, that we have all of these gadgets and things to consume and buy, and the very real cost and exploitation and brutality that and raw exploitation of extracting surplus value that went into every single one of those commodities is then obscured out of the picture completely, and now this is just a product that you as a consumer can choose to buy or not. And that whole process of production is something that is forcefully taken out of our gaze. Mm-hmm. But even right now in a contemporary political moment, which I think these questions have relevance only in their like sort of contemporaneous political potency. The Kilmar Abrego Garcia disappearing, right? That's something that's happening right now. Folks like us are going to be obviously engaged in understanding what's happening. But think of all the people, and Palestine is another great example, who come across this stuff, our fellow Americans, who will see it on the background, or it'll be a news clip that they're watching, and the next one bleeds in, or they'll scan past something on their phone and see the brutalities happening in Palestine, and then there is a psychological unseeing, a sense that I don't like seeing this. I don't like the questions that I might have to ask myself if I really see it. I don't like the moral responsibility that might be implied on myself by seeing it. And so there is a way in which, even right now on the most contemporary, hottest topics that are occurring in our world right now, it is precisely this mass unseeing that is one of the core problems to actually solving these problems. If you clockwork orange people's eyes and made them see all the things that are unseen in our society, I think you would have like a cultural revolution on your hands or something. I mean, there would still be forms of denial and repression and all that stuff, but to really like make people see is an interesting thing, and the effects it would have, because precisely in the unseen is this fear of what it means to fully see. Especially something brutal like Palestine, or even something as singular as the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case.
Yeah, no, it's this constant regimen of negation that it takes to live in these cities. In fact, yes, absolutely resembles something that is very familiar to all of us, and like even something as visible and as globally broadcast as the ongoing genocide in Palestine. People still find ways to navigate around it.
Well, I'll use an example. Just the other day, a number of us were at, or just outside the general consulate of El Salvador here in Atlanta. Because we're like, well, where's a good place to protest? It's a visible highway, consulate's right there, makes sense. And was talking to folks about Kilmar's case, and a thing I heard multiple times. Most of the people, I want to give credit to most of the people were rightfully horrified and had the right response, and a lot of them stood with us even for a while, even not knowing who we were. But a couple people were like, well, what was this guy's relationship to MS-13? And I was like, well, or something like that, right? And there is no established relationship to that. But it's like, well, if this guy really has no connection to MS-13, which, like, if he did, I still wouldn't be okay with it. But, there's no evidence of that. But if they don't have a reason that it's okay, then they have seen something that hurts them. And I want to read from this book, when our inspector, our main character, gets a call about some information to this woman he's inspecting the death of. And the information was gotten sort of illicitly. It was somebody from the other city saw a wanted or a missing poster in their city, and he shouldn't have done that. He said, my informant should not have seen the posters. They were not in his country. He should never have told me. He made me accessory. The information was an allergen embezzle. The mere fact of it in my head was a kind of trauma. I was complicit. It was done. Right? And it's like, he now has to acknowledge he knows this, and he's trying to find a way to work around the fact that he knows it. He's trying to, and everyone has to do that in the city. In this world, until our character decides, fuck it, I'm done with this. If you see a guy running away from murdering someone, but he's in the other city, you have to be like, man, you have to just kind of shrug. It is. And so it's better to just not acknowledge. If you see a wanted poster, if you see a crime happening, if you see a starving person, you can just be like, well, they're in the other city. And I would posit, I'll bet you people in Oklahoma and Bez will see people in their own city that are starving or in trouble and say, are we sure that's in our city? Maybe not. And keep going. Yeah. He doesn't say that, but I have an inkling that that's what would happen.
Oh yeah, and there's 3 chapters prior to this where there's stuff that they're very consciously unseeing. Not just the old lady that Inspector Borlu sees right at the end of chapter 1, but also it filters down to like the shift patterns of the skate park, right? The mutual sort of understanding in the community that, okay, like people sell drugs here at this time, people skate here at this time, this, that, and the other happens during the day, and we just kind of look the other way. There is that. There is the there's the bits and pieces that they're sort of that they're tracking when they're trying to find out who this murdered woman is that they discovered. You know, there's a legal assistant that perhaps she might be that's gone missing, and that turns out to be a red herring. But the reason she went missing is because she resigned without notice, because, you don't give notice to employers like that. Employers like what? It doesn't matter. Like there's all this decay and corruption that you have to consciously filter out in order to do your job as an inspector on this force.
In fact, our inspector kind of has to push the fact that maybe she's not a prostitute to continue to get resources to investigate her death, right? Because if she was a prostitute, even if she was a prostitute of that city, the city would no longer see it as worthwhile to look into her death. And I won't, I would highly recommend people read this book. I don't always say that, so I won't go through all the plot details, this and that. It's very clever. It's very fun noir. For all our problems with police, there's a reason people like police serials. It's a very good way of telling a story. You reveal information. You have a character who knows about as much as you do, and so the author can just tell you things, and doesn't feel forced or weird or like bad exposition. So, it's a great way of telling a story, even if you got to be in the mind of a cop to do it. But I think it's important too to say, so this woman that was murdered, who it actually turns out to be, is Mahalia Gear, a American who was studying first in Basel, then in Oklahoma. And she is fascinated with the concept of a third place, right? There's two cities. There's the city and the city. And she's like, well, what if there's also, I guess, and the city there? What if there is this place called Orsini that is in between the two cities, that is maybe running the show, or there's some conspiracy or something like that? She doesn't seem to have it fully figured out. And there's even a popular book that was banned, but not strictly enforced, called Between the City and the City. That was written, that she got interested in, and things like that. And so this woman ends up dead, and after the red herrings kind of melt away and they're interesting and they do reveal things about the city, you start to sort of learn, okay, it has something to do with the fact that she was looking into Orsini. And I was wondering if either of you have thoughts. What are your thoughts on Orsini? What is Orsini? And does it stand in for anything in particular? I was getting a lot of like Althusser like type vibes going on throughout this whole thing, but that bit specifically stuck out to me.
Yeah, I'll jump into this. I definitely have some thoughts on that. First thing I wanted to say is I just wanted to highlight your point about, at first the victim was seen as a prostitute. And there are ways that the unseeing applies to people, and there are non-people or half people in our society. Sex workers are obviously always one of them. But also the immigrant, right? In the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, he's an immigrant. He's not really one of us. What do we care? He's not even a U.S. citizen. And then you're having that conversation, and they say, well, he has ties to MS-13. Then you go into his actual family story. He's like, no, he was a 16-year-old in El Salvador. His family's tortilla shop was being pressed by a local gang. The young men in his family, including himself, were being threatened if they don't join the gang. So his family had a love for their son, sends him abroad to try and get him into safety. And so now you find yourself in America. You just work hard, construction jobs, low wage, under the table a lot of the times. You meet a girl, you create a family. Now, she has, I think, 2 kids with some disabilities, and then they have a child together. So you're a father, you're a worker, you're contributing to this society. You had a shitty childhood, your parents tried to save you, and then some dumbass who knows none of that comes over like, wasn't he a member of MS-13?
Yep.
And then if you can somehow convince them that no, he wasn't a member of MS-13, the next thing they'll say is, well, he did come into this country illegally, and that itself is a crime. A crime punishable by death torture? Mm-hmm. A crime punishable by life in prison with no due process? The same people who want, thump their chest and talk about them being the real Constitution, it's just thrown out the window as soon as they can otherize somebody, right? Yep. As soon as they can say, well, I believe in the Constitution and freedom and all this stuff for me and people like me, but that immigrant or sex worker or Muslim is not me. Therefore, none of these things that I claim to care about actually apply. And it goes back to the idea of Clockwork Oranging people to see their whole lives. If you could have to watch his whole life, like a movie from beginning to end, Would you say, isn't he a part of MS? He's not really, because dehumanization is how you
Yeah.
unsee.
Mm-hmm.
If you can dehumanize the person, that is a way of unseeing them as a full human being, and therefore there's no moral responsibility, there's no actual concern. I don't see myself in them whatsoever. So it is, I think, especially in this moment, a revolutionary act to plow through those boundaries in your own psychology and to force others to see what they're trying so desperately not to see. In the case of Palestine, in the case of this fascist disappearing of immigrants, etc. So the fact that this whole thing starts with the death of somebody who is actually an educated, thoughtful, politically active human being, and they have to kind of first assume that this is just a prostitute, right? And then that's their starting point. I think that is a way that like China Miéville is kind of gesturing towards that type of unseeing. But
And I will say on that front before we hop back into Orsini, I know I asked the question, but to just say really briefly, I think it also takes, in the story, obviously we have our main guy, but we also have like this lower level police officer, Corey, who cares whether this person's a prostitute or not, like from the position they are, and really pushes it and makes it a problem,
Mm-hmm.
and the equivalent, obviously the analogies can get difficult when we're talking about characters who are police officers, but bear with me. But the we have to in our lives, even with what limited capacity we have, we're not Breach, we don't have whatever, but make it a problem, make people see it.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't do something about it, talk about it. If you can't talk about it, right, find a way to get it in people's heads. It's why even I've seen small towns with very, very small protest movements that turn into something meaningful because you cannot ignore it. But I also think because it's so horrible, having to unsee, it leads into people wanting to have an explanation, have another thing, well, there must be some conspiracy. Plus just the ideal of having some third interesting, feeling like you cracked the code. And I do think that's where Orsini starts to kind of come into this.
Well, yeah, this idea, Orsini, is that it's something that exists within these dissensi, right? These disputed zones, right? It's inherently
There's a secret third city running the show. Yeah.
Yes, a secret third thing, and this idea indeed that within these contradictions, within these arbitrary divisions, there might indeed be a villain, a puppet master, something that you can contend with. That acknowledging it contributes to the demystification of it, right? Because now there's something you can interact with. As it turns out, there is an unseen force that is maintaining these things. It is called Breach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that maybe is worth defining. Breach is both like a noun and a verb. Breach is to, like what we said, see the other city. To breach is to acknowledge. To breach very seriously is to like go over and interact with the other city. For example, if someone was murdered across city lines and it wasn't done legally, in quotations, like you went over with the right paperwork, that would be a breach. But breach is also a police force that seems to just have essentially infinite power. And until very late in the book, I was like, okay, well, this at the very least is magic, right? Like this feels like, no. We just did our goofy Harry Potter miniseries. These are the dementors. I don't know. These are, because they come out of nowhere. They're like shapes from the darkness who rise up out of nothing.
Well, but that's the wild part of it, though, is that like they're
but they're not. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That sort of magical aspect about them is, to my mind, their ability to move relatively normally, right? They can walk within both cities, they can perceive both cities, and the very fact of them not having whatever reflex it is that you have to develop to consciously walk in one and not the other makes them appear super fast, blurry. It's a sort of force that exists solely in your peripheral vision if you're in one city or the other, just by virtue of how they're able to interact with both.
Yeah, it feels very much like the idea of someone who's accepted, your enemy is able to operate outside the rules that you were forced to operate within, right? They can go from city to city, and then you suddenly can't see them. If you do see them, then they have permission to arrest you. It's a bullshit set of rules that even like the governments of both cities are like, this is stupid and I hate this. Like, but nobody can really do anything about it because they've got all this power and they've just been around. I do like that they basically just say breach all the time, like they're like a Pokemon or something like that. They're just like breach and they grab you. But like, it turns out that they're just like they're just another like set of like shabby offices with just another set of shabby people, most of them who were abducted off the streets for crimes that weren't that serious or were dubbed not that serious to further enforce the system. Once again, it's all just part of like the structure that's been built, both literally in the sense of, the offices and the people in the offices. They have no supernatural ability. They have cameras. They've got no special knowledge into your brain. They've just got guys who report on them at the different ministries. And yeah, and it's also part of that. So the idea of them being supernatural, no. The idea of Orsini, no. There's nothing really running the show. It's just the ideology and then the enforcement of it. And yeah, I don't know, Breach and Orsini, Brett, what are your thoughts?
Okay, so yeah, I'll give you my theory. I'd love to hear both of your thoughts, and I'll go through the whole thing. Well, there's this applicability aspect where the breach serves this function much like the deep state or even the CIA fill for us, which is this Foucault-esque panopticon idea, like this conspiratorial, shadowy, all-powerful force that pulls the puppet strings around the world. But when you actually pull back the curtain and see the little man behind, when you actually walk into the CIA offices and talk to these people, they're not particularly omnipotent, powerful puppeteers. They're often very ordinary and, to be honest, unimpressive people. I've had the FBI visit me a few times over the years, and they always walk away giving me the impression of these are just like very just unimpressive, normal people. Not unimpressive in a pejorative sense, but just like, I thought this was the FBI, and it's just dudes.
Yeah, Brett, I'll say my friend who was briefly at the CIA offices, like he went through there on like a maintenance thing, said he's like, I saw a lot of like liberal arts from Brigham Young University certificates, right? Like, it's like, these are just some guys like from Utah,
Yes. And that plays the role into this Orsini idea, because I think the function of Orsini is this sort of paranoid conspiratorial illusion produced by ideology, much in the same way that the right, the reactionaries, and people across the board, really. I mean, there's versions of this on the center and the left as well. This conspiratorial attempt to grasp the dynamics of capitalism, imperialism. When you don't have a critique of political economy, of the capitalist system, of imperialism as a globalized form of monopoly capital, you're left with these huge question marks that ideology attempts to convince you of, right? Well, actually, we're fighting for freedom and democracy. The Israelis have a right to defend themselves. Work harder, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You can become rich too. Like, there's all this ideological buffeting of reality, but still, there's huge gaps for any thinking person in that reality. Yeah. And so what fills that gap in lieu of actual material analysis is often some form of conspiratorialism. And for conspiracies to get off the ground, there has to be the puppeteers. And that fits perfectly with this right-wing obsession of the deep state, which does exist as a material force, but not as a conspiratorial cabal, right? Yeah. And it's precisely conspiracies generated by the shabbiness of an ideology that actually is also decaying. So as the ideology of America, the superstructure of American dominance, as the material base of that decays, so too does its ideological superstructure, right, which opens up these gaping holes of question marks that people have to then fill in one way or another. And they can fill it in a bunch of different ways, but conspiracy is a big way to do it. So my contention, and maybe this isn't textually justified, and I'd love to hear if you have criticisms of this, but it's actually that Breach is just regular people. Orsini is materially real. Orsini is the actual material integration of these two cities. If you get past the ideology and the perceptual apparatus and the conditioning, if all of that fell away, what you'd see is just one city called Orsini transcending the dualisms of self and other, the Basel and the El Kumas, the fashion, the linguist difference, the class differences. If you had a thoroughgoing revolution, if you broke through ideological conditioning, all that would be there is actually Orsini. And in order to, and the breach plays this role of policing that ideological border, but at the end of the day, let me see how I put it. I wrote it down. I said, I see Orsini as the integrated whole. It's not a third city. It's the only actual city that exists, undivided by perception, ideology, law, class. It's the possibility, which is real and actually already there, of a single, integrated, undivided city. Even though it objectively exists, it can only come into fruition as a lived reality for the people once the dualisms of self-other, us-them, rich-poor are transcended, right? And that would take a revolutionary rupture from the ideological superstructure. And so that's kind of my idea. And the breach and why Bourdieu is eventually recruited into the breach is people that have, through accident or through critical study, have broken through the ideology, have ceased being an ideological subject, and have started becoming a critical agent. In the same way that Marxism allows us to stop being merely ideological subjects of our society and become critical agents of that society. And that is a sort of taking away of the ideological lens. We're not totally free from it, of course, and it's a constant battle to prevent ourselves from being sucked back into it. But Marxism is this amazing critical tool where we can take off the lenses of ideology and kind of see it for what it is. And a lot of people, especially young folks that come over to Marxism, they'll have this moment of like, this sucks. Like, actually, I kind of wish I could put back on the glasses because it's pretty shitty to see the world through this lens, which is just the real way that the world actually exists in all its ugly ways outside of ideological capture. So that's kind of my theory on Orsini. And I'd love to hear both of your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks well of, I mean, in that sense, right? It speaks well of Theodore, of Inspector Bourdieu, that he can't really go back, right? And this is jumping way to the end, right? But he joins up with Breach. He can't go back to being in one city or the other, and yet he is a citizen of both. And there's the irony, right? Because he takes off those ideological blinders, but he also has the ability to exist in these places that are products of ideology we are perhaps led to believe in the first place, right? And that's the thing. It's I have like bits and pieces of a thesis here, but like, the end of history is the monster. Nothing ever happens or else. What if there is a conspiracy dedicated to maintaining contradictions, right? And that's how I view Breach, right? Is there is any sort of concept of an objective sort of history of these two cities has been lost, right? All that matters is keeping them divided. And again, you have the irony there of, okay, you've taken off these ideological blinders, but it's in service of this force that maintains what we are led to believe is an ideology in the first place of separation, a pornography of separation indeed, right? Something that exists purely for, not titillation, but purely for the sake of its own consumption. I do find it funny that Bowden, the person who, the professor who posits that these two cities were reunited, who posits that there was an Orsini and then eventually like recants that there was, he still gets contacted by like ancient aliens people, right? Because there is that sort of conspiratorialism. You're right, Breht, that arises in the absence of a rhetorical framework to deal with all this. And yet he himself can't really break free from it, right? Because that's part of the reason that he hooks up with the murdered woman Mahalia in the first place, is because she's a medium through which he can still explore this possibility of there having been a basis for this separation.
I think it's Orsini both is a possibility and is a distraction too, right? Like, because there is, there's maybe a couple ways you can see Orsini, right? Orsini is, on the one hand, a thing that ancient aliens people are looking for, as it's the city that's controlling all of us, which they're really just looking for Breach, right? They're looking past Breach, the thing that's right there that we all know runs things, towards this other thing, right? It's almost like somebody who wants to look right past the capitalists and say, well, there's a secret Marxist conspiracy to make my rent expensive. It's like, well, no, actually, you know, the guy is your landlord, right? Or you don't know him. It's a website, right? But still, there's not a conspiracy. Orsini didn't do that. Breach did. That said, you know, Breach, this Orsini can also be, you know, it's a useful fantasy, but it seems like there could be a broad movement to unite. There are unificationists that are repressed in different types of ways. And there is like a sort of premature unificationist rebellion at the end of this book that doesn't work very well, that actually, like, you know, uses migrants to its own ends. It gets them hurt and is very messy and bad, or just ineffective generally. But yeah, no, I think, yeah, Orsini is, you could say Orsini is what these cities are. They're at least, whatever you want to call them, there is a one city that could work very well as a single city. They already work pretty well as separate cities, and they're working very hard to make it that way. I also think it's interesting that there is, you know, the real forces at play are Breach, right? Which again is just some guys in offices who have just acknowledged that it's all bullshit and they're going to enforce it anyway. It is the, you know, it is the capitalists who have read Marx. They understand class society and they know they're on the side of the bourgeoisie in a way. If you want to give them a very, very, you know, very, very harsh reading, which I kind of do. I do see the end of the inspector joining at the end. Maybe I'll see it as more hopeful. I see it as pretty bleak that he's going to reinforce this structure that he's been awakened from. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in some like fictional sequel.
No, I agree with you.
He leads the revolution. Yeah, but I don't think that's what we're supposed to read here. But I also think it's interesting that you know, the people who are seeing through it are, you know, you have some college kids, some like that are like intellectuals that are trying to break through it, but they don't know how, and they're bad at it, and they just piss people off, right? You have some just like kind of oddballs like on the side, like, you know, you have like these like little unificationist groups that it's described as like, you know, kind of runty people with like tattoos or looking kind of strange in like a rundown kitchen. I'm like, yeah, how many times have I been there, right? Like, you know, just the people that kind of like can make the connection, and there's a vested state interest in keeping them down. But obviously, but we need something like this to sort of look through it, to see through it, to think, okay, well, how are we dealing with that? And then it leads one to think, okay, so if you did live in these cities, how would you organize? How would you build resistance? How would you, and I don't know for sure, but it is an interesting question, right?
Well, and indeed, like, how wouldn't you organize, right? Because there's also like every reason to just blend in, right? There's a bit in chapter 21 that's kind of a side thing, but Borlu's in a taxi in Ulcoma, and the taxi driver is a Kurdish immigrant, and he's like, yeah, Ulcoma's the best city. And it's like, yeah, for 4 years in a refugee camp and like rigidly studying for citizenship to exist in this city where you have to disbelieve in this other city, it fucking better be the best city.
Yeah. And yeah, so I would love to pick up on a strain that each of you started weaving there. Please. That I think is really interesting. Lenore, and I think, you know, Jacob talked about it too, about Borlu, what's his name? Borlu, at the end, and sort of the ambiguity of what's happening here. But I think this text, a text by Edward Said, makes sense of it. Edward Said has this really readable, accessible text called Representations of the Intellectual. And in that book, he talks about two distinct types, and this is kind of Gramscian as well, two distinct types of intellectual. There is the, you know, in Gramscian terms, organic intellectual, who becomes the critical agent in rebellion against the system, right? And you can think of Marxists, these types. All of us here are, you know, one version of that or another. Not to pat ourselves too much on the back, but, you know, we're thinking people that are interested in ideas, and that's why we're on a podcast like this. And then there's the establishment intellectuals, right? The people that are clever, they understand things more than ideology. They're not fully captured by ideological fog. You can think of somebody like Kissinger and I think Edward Said uses him as an example. Like these are people that know better. they kind of know the game that's happening, and they've chosen the side of the system
Right.
for various reasons. It's not always evil, villain, nefarious reasons. They talk themselves into it. And hell, on the other side of that is a great paycheck and the long-term stability and praise by the system as a whole, and you get to write op-eds in the New York Times. Like, it's a comfortable
Nobel
ass.
fucking Peace Prize for Kissinger.
Exactly right. So if you're going to use your intellect, like I'm broke as shit with a bunch of student medical
Right.
debt, like if maybe I could have used this to be part of the system, I'd be a little better off. So there's a deep material lure there. But that's kind of the situation that Bourdieu finds himself in at the end. He's always been a cop. He's always been invested in the system at some level. And this is kind of like a promotion. And he's not going to turn into a radical revolutionary. The dead woman was kind of that.
Yeah.
And you mentioned students. Students are these people that have not been so they're thinking people, they're being educated, they're at this crucial juncture in their life where they're trying to figure out who they are and what their values are. And so often those people will become critics of the system. They're not invested materially in the system yet. They're finding out who they are. There's a rebelliousness of youth. So they're also kind of annoying, and they lack life experience, and they're an easy target by the right. Oh, these college kids, they think they know so much. They don't know shit. They're still learning, and they're kind of like morally righteous, and they're over the top, and they don't even know what it's like to have to pay rent or raise a family. What the hell could they tell us? And so they're an easy target of denigration, but they're also like a fountain of optimism and youth, and like that's why the youth disproportionately are much more shifted towards radical ideas, at least for a time. Many of them do get co-opted back into the system, and it takes work to stay critical. But there is that opening in youth that is there, and so I think that explains some of that. But then on the other side, we were talking about Orsini and what it could represent, and and even in this unificationist, there's these like racial and immigrant dynamics that are still a problem, right? And I think of like real Orsini being realized, it would have to be through, in our terminology, socialist and communist revolution that would actually solve the contradictions at their core and would, like in the case of Palestine, right? What we want is not, ideally, is not a two-state solution where you have this Jewish ethno-supremacists allied with U.S. imperialist state on the borders of this struggling, impoverished, exploited Palestinian state that's beleaguered already from the get-go. What we advocate for is a single, multiracial, unified, democratic state of Palestine where Jews, Muslims, Christians, and secular people can live as equals with equal constitutional and human rights. Like, that is the obvious solution to this disgusting, settler colonial apartheid contradiction. That's unacceptable, obviously, to ethno-supremacists. So they just can't fathom that. And the two-state solution is, even they won't accept that, but it's unthinkable to think that they could have that thing, because then they'd have to see the Arab Palestinian as an equal, and that's unacceptable to that ideology. But that can only come about through socialist revolution. So if you try to do unification without addressing those contradictions at the root through thoroughgoing revolution, then it's going to generate those contradictions still. You're still going to have the contradictions of the immigrant issue, the racial issues, the nation of origin issues, language issues, class issues. And so Orsini can't be realized if you maintain those contradictions. It's kind of like trying to reform capitalism, like the democratic ideal. We can reform capitalism into something that works for everybody. No, the fuck you can't.
Yeah.
You can try forever, and we will never, ever get there. There's still going to be racism, still going to be poverty, still going to be endless war forever. That's because the root cause is not being addressed. You're addressing the symptoms, you're not addressing the root cause. So for Orsini to come into real existence, it would be like the Palestinian multiracial democratic singular state come into real existence. That would take a total upheaval of the ideological superstructure and the material base of reality, which can only happen through full-on revolution, and an international one at that, to be honest.
Definitely.
So those are kind of some of the thoughts.
Exactly.
This book even understands that, like, the reformist angle, like, who is one of the main villains at the end? It's the social democrat.
Exactly.
He's as far left as you can get in this structure, and by virtue of having risen within this structure, right? He still has the he can still square with his like particular worldview, using the right-wing nationalists as foot soldiers and speaking to them specifically, like there's only one city and it's Beige,
I think it's important. I won't
Exactly.
go into all the details because, again, I recommend people read the book if you have the time. But basically, what ends up kind of being the expose of what happened here, is that Mahalia was getting duped, not by the idea that there could be a better future, but she was tricked into thinking that she was being communicated with by an Orsini that already exists, right? That something already exists. She doesn't have to build it, right? Don't build it. Just send us your money or whatever. Send us your $5 a month, Mahalia. Presumably is that this world's equivalent of like the Nancy Pelosi text. And basically having them send over this like very valuable artifacts of unclear what the technology does exactly, but it's something useful. That then these foreign corporations, these are foreign American corporations who can't actually get access to Olcoma because of their own sanctions, are able to get around sanctions through this company that is getting these things from this dig site that this girl is working on. And it is being run by an alliance between these like nationalist foot soldiers on the ground, basically these like fascist thugs who are doing the enforcement, who are doing the actual murders when they need done, and people in government, such as like this social democrat on their council, who is like, well, we need to catch up, we need to do better. And because he is not talking about a revolution, right? But because as a social democrat, he's talking about how do I make Bezel better, right? How do I make Bezel better? Well, what he should be thinking is, how do I make Bezel not Bezel? How do I make Bezel and Olcoma one city? But he's not able to think of that. Like the furthest left he can go is, if I bring in jobs, then maybe we can like get a Medicare plan going in Bezel. And therefore he's trapped in this. And so what? He falls back on reaction. He falls back on all these things. And it is why, and Mahalia has to die because she sees through this, and because it's not possible anymore, and because she's not able to be exploited, right? Because at first she sees through the contradictions, and then there's that another layer of trap. There's that like there's that second academicized, whatever layer of, okay, we can exist in this in-between space, and she's able to break through that. And that is when the club like fully comes down on her. And that is the point where the system has to just fully reveal its violence. And there are no other really ways of keeping that in check, because the social things have failed. Financial things have failed. So then the system just, it reveals like, no, we are actually willing to break our own laws and kill you. Which that gets solved and resolved. But of course, the primary problem isn't resolved, because the city and the city exist as independent entities at the end in everyone's mind.
Yeah, and that's why I think China Miéville, being a Marxist, like, you can't create a book like this if you don't have that background knowledge, It's a very Marxist book in that way. And it reminds me, we just did an episode like a month or so ago on the German Revolution, and it was the German Social Democratic Party that teamed up with the Freikorps, the right-wing foot soldiers that would eventually blossom into the Nazis, to kill Rosa and Karl, brutally, to squash the communists, who would actually be invested not in saving Germany, but in creating a new way of being. And it's the same thing here in the U.S. You got, the Social Democrats, like the Bernie and the AOC types, and they're not like in their heads thinking, oh, we have to crush the left and make sure that but it's the ideological position they naturally fill by their role in the Democratic Party and what the Democratic Party actually is here for. AOC had that email last week, last month or so. It kind of went around. It didn't stay in the media cycle that long, but it was this idea where she texted out to her supporters like, the Republicans call me a communist, but I don't have to be a scary extremist to want a better America for all workers, or something like that, right? So she's like disavowing the left, right, which is just falling into this idea that the left are inherently bad, scary extremists in the first place, and then reifying the idea of America. That's as far left, as Lenore said, that this system can go, and that's why the system itself has to break. We're not interested, actually, in making America great again from a social democratic perspective. To actually solve the contradictions of America would be a revolutionary rupture and transcendence of America as such. There is no way to make it good. It's a settler colonial project created by slavery, maintained by brutal imperialism, all for the singular economic purpose of siphoning as much wealth and resources to a tiny elite ruling class as possible. There's no way to make that nice. There's no way to make that equitable. And so, that project is doomed from the start. But lots of people in the system that are still subject to the ideology of the system see that as their only hope. So you have these fight the oligarchy rallies and tens of thousands of people showing up and people like begging and pleading for something because they're still captured by capitalist realism. They can't see beyond, they can't imagine what it would actually take to build the world that they actually want, even if they can't quite articulate it. And the best thing this system has to offer is a Bernie and an AOC, which they're not evil people. I don't think that they're nefarious, terrible, immoral people. I think they themselves are also captured by ideology, and they think that they're doing the best that they can, and maybe they are.
Yeah.
But that's why you have to be a critical agent, I think, and you have to break through that ideology. We're in that moment.
I like you add that too, because it's very often not a conspiracy in the sense of there is a secret thing running the show. It's like actually much of the ruling class, with certain exceptions, you mentioned them, often are captured by the exact same traps we do here. The social democrats and the nationalists at the top in Bezel are also not allowed to see Coma, right? Or not allowed in quotations, right? I'll say here, as we're like kind of coming to the end here, I think it's important that we recognize that we don't, the alternative isn't to build back better in, as Biden would say, there's some bit with big build back Bezel that I could do, but I don't have it. But like, that would be the alternative, right? Like Bezel is struggling. Let's catch up. Let's do better. Let's have the faster cars that you're not technically allowed to see out of the corner of your eye to make those old Comans feel jealous, but they can't say it because they can't acknowledge that they saw us, right? That would be the alternative, and that can't be allowed. And I really think if this was written by a lesser author, or even not a lesser author, just not a Marxist, this book would end with our inspector, as everyone's rioting the streets, standing up and being like, let us come together. And then they were like, and then that new day, the new city was founded, right? Like,
exactly.
Maybe it would be a little better than that if it was a good writer, but you can't. That's actually not how it works. It doesn't work like that. In fact, the 20 most radical guys in Coma can't just get together, have a riot, and now we have Orson, a city of Orsini. Because again, I actually say this all the time in local organizing, because I talk to people and I'm like, dude, if that's how we did it, we would have done it 200 years ago, right?
Yeah, it's a nice fable, but there's a reason that a book like The Crab Cannery Ship ends with everybody getting their asses kicked, and the last line is, and then they did it one more time, because there has to be that striving towards something. And Brett, you bringing up the Bernie and AOC and the AOC email actually really crystallizes something, because it puts me in mind of how Breach doesn't really speak in ideology, doesn't really speak in anything concrete. It speaks in parameters, right? You are in breach, he's not in breach. This room is where your trial is taking place. There are less severe and more severe infractions. They set boundaries. They, reappropriate language, just like, AOC says, the concept of wanting better conditions for everybody, facially is not radical. Of course, by the nature of what America is, it takes radical transformation. But but she says, well, the actual organizing and the paradigm shifts that it takes to get there, she says, well, that's scary and radical. And what it draws you into, if you're going here and you buy what they're selling, is, literally just maintaining these contradictions as Breach does, right? And on page 248 here, it really, I think, crystallizes the whole essence of the project. The breach was nothing. It is nothing. This is a commonplace. This is simple stuff. The breach has no embassies, no army, no sights to see. The breach has no currency. If you commit it, it will envelop you. Breach is void, full of angry police.
Mm-hmm. And so that's how it concludes. And if you wish that the characters had done something different, then you actually have to be the one to go and do something different, right? The onus is on you, the reader, to see what you're not allowed to see and act how you're not allowed to act, and build a mass movement that can refuse to acknowledge this. I forget who said it, but authoritarian governments, capitalist governments, whatever type of government, fascist governments even, they don't work if enough people say no. And just as Breach wouldn't work if everybody in the city at the same time been like, yeah, no, that guy, what's up? And they just dap up a guy from Coma. And if everybody does that at the exact same time, what are they going to do about it? Right. But if one guy does it, or even if 100 guys do it, they can crack down on you, and they need that mysticism, and they need that ideology, and they need that buy-in. And And so it has to be popularized. It has to have a program. It has to have somewhere it's going. There has to be a pitch for a better future. And also for the sake of everybody, at least in Oklahoma and Bezel, they got to get those Canadian and American imperialists out of there because they're clearly fucking things up too. But yeah. Do y'all have any, do you have any last thoughts on this book? There's a ton we could have talked about that we didn't, but that's just because I really want to leave a lot of this for people to experience themselves. There's a lot of fun twists and turns and characters that I think deserve their own experience. But do any of y'all have any like final thoughts or takeaways here?
I would just end on this thought, which is I love a podcast like this and a discussion like this because we're reading a book that almost certainly a lot of people won't have read and won't read in preparation for this, but we're able to use it as a lens, a cultural product as a lens through which to analyze the real issues of our time. So I love both of your insights. I think they're wonderful. I think the book itself is really interesting and worth reading if you have the time and the interest to do so. But I think what we were able to do here today is extract the core lessons and apply it to our own situation. And that's, I think, what good cultural products do, is they kind of put you in a position of breaking out of the ideological subjectivity and to think critically in various ways. And with a Marxist writer as such a good writer as well as a serious Marxist thinker, he's able to achieve things that I think, as we all pointed out earlier, most writers wouldn't have been able to do. So this has been like a really productive, really interesting conversation, and I think it highlights the importance and depth of your show, that you're able to have conversations like these and use books that most people won't even have heard of as a stepping stone into a full-on analysis of the entire global system and our role within it. Like Harry Potter, as Ryan says in the chat.
Yeah. Liked this a whole lot more than Harry Potter. I gotta say that. No hate if you liked it as a kid. We talked about that. But yeah, Lenore, do you have any final thoughts? And then I just had one more thing I wanted to kind of close this out. I hear your cat has thoughts in the background
there. Oh yeah. No, Shiloh has a lot of thoughts. Maybe we'll have her on when we eventually do Kraken. But yeah, no, so I love, and it's very, very early on, but it really hammers home, I think, just how human these institutions are, despite their mystification, despite the incredible, institutional power that they're vested with, despite indeed the dominance over perception and reality that institutions like Breach have. At the end of the day, they're people. They are as fallible and as vulnerable as we. They just have a different access to, the correlation of the various contents of our world. On page 10, when it talks about like the league table of instinct, right? How extraordinary it is for police to sort of put these things together to even do their jobs and like maintain a semblance of order, a semblance of competence, right? Mm-hmm. It's that sort of skill is extraordinary, and it really highlights just how vulnerable this whole edifice is if we make that sort of perception and that sort of action much more commonplace and much more organized. It can happen before and it'll happen again.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the one more point I just wanted to make really quick is I mentioned up front, I think that this is Althusserian in a lot of ways, and there's some specific ways that it is, which is, in Althusser's work, he talks about the ideological state apparatus, and that's kind of what we're dealing with. In so many ways, this is a Marxist text, but Miéville is taking Althusserian concepts of the ideological state apparatus, the repressive state apparatus, right? The breach, repressive state apparatus being the actual physical forms of repression, the police, the army, the state as such, the breach, the police force, and the ideological state apparatus is schools, culture, it's the superstructure, mm-hmm. right? And how that shapes perception. And he has this concept of interpolation, which is how ideology transforms individuals into ideological subjects. And he works through that in his book in really fascinating ways. And so what I see this book as is Miéville creating a fictional story around these core Marxist, but also specifically Althusserian concepts. And through doing that really helps you understand how it plays out in the real world, because reading Althusser, it's philosophy. It can get abstract. It can get difficult to follow. And I think a really good writer can take complex philosophical ideas and turn them into like immediately engaging and accessible stories that leave you pondering deep concepts that you otherwise wouldn't find anywhere else but in philosophy. So I just wanted to say that at the end here too, that this is very Althusserian and in a really interesting way. And if you struggle to read Althusser, reading this book by China Miéville is like a fictional way of understanding Althusserian philosophy, in the same way that Miéville's book October was a fictional way of understanding the real history of the October Revolution.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's, to bring it back to Miéville's quote from I read earlier in the episode, the artist has a role in the revolution that is not, greater or lesser than that of the plumber or the organizer, whatever it is. But it has to not just be the revolution itself. There's plenty of revolutionary art. The revolutionary art doesn't do the revolution. The revolutionary art is useful if it spurs the revolution. If consuming the revolutionary art is then your revolution for the day, then you did no revolution for the day, right? If you watch, I don't know, it's not really revolutionary art, but if you watch Hunger Games, you see people overthrow a government and you say, yay, I'm here, I'm happy with this. I did my revolution for the day. No, you didn't. Of course you didn't. You know what I mean? And so it is books like this that are like, okay, so now here's the next thing. You see the problems, now take it a step forward. That's why, as always, we encourage people, get involved, find a way to plug in. We always try to link different ways to plug in and share different stuff like that. But, there's a lot of work to be done, especially now. We got to unsee the cities because it's not getting any better out here. And, Breach is not getting any lighter. And the promise even of the social democrat showing up and making it a more comfortable prison to live in is I think, long gone, at least for those of us in the United States and mostly around the world. But for those of us who have accepted the premise of this society and how it runs, we're okay with that because we know that was never the answer. And we should decry these false answers. We should say no build back Basel, no, like whatever. Let's fucking do something new. Let's find Orsini and build it and make it real. And it only happens when we realize it together. So once again, appreciate y'all. And the show is RevLeft Radio and Red Menace. Y'all check out Brett's shows. We're going to link them here. And yeah, really, really appreciate you coming on, Brett.
Thank you both so much, and Ryan as well. I had a great time and a really insightful conversation. I really appreciate it.
Good stuff.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. You have a good one.
Peace out.
Thank you for listening to Socialist Shelf Radio.